Well, it's a pleasure to be here at this particular conference, and some of the things that make me excited about this particular conference is all in one place and all in one day. We're hearing about things like deep networks of learning in machine learning at the cognitive level and ties to brain plasticity that are happening in very particular networks, and efforts to tie this to educational and learning experiences. And so this is a space that I get really excited about occupying. My position at Stanford University is actually one of like two very different worlds. One as one of the first members of the Graduate School of Education to try to make connections to the world of neuroscience. And it's a very interesting place because I find myself moving between very different worlds. And what I'd like to do in this talk is find points of connection between these worlds that might be meaningful. So on the right side, we have the world of education. And fascinating things are happening, especially in the years of early elementary school. There are remarkable transformations that are occurring in these years that we can see before our eyes. Kids are developing brand new cognitive abilities and brand new powerful cognitive abilities as they break into literacy, the ability to recognize thousands and thousands of visual words and instantly map them to exactly what their targets are in the linguistic world. Is emerging before our eyes, and we think that the emergence of those skills is being driven by very particular types of learning experiences that are happening in these classroom, these pedagogically structured environments. At the same time, on the neuroscience side, we think that these changes can be tied directly through brain mapping studies and studies of brain plasticity to neurobiological changes that are happening in the brain, where we can start to isolate these circuits and start to understand them. But then the really tough question comes, and we saw this question at the end of Ed's talk. It's like the question of how do these two worlds actually connect in some kind of meaningful way? How do we take insights which have been specialized to really drive science forward at the level of brain science and within these worlds and within these contexts and map it into things that we can have meaningful dialogue and constructive transdisciplinary interactions with teachers that might actually wind up making an impact on some really crucial societal needs. And I'd like to humbly present a couple of places where I think we might be getting warmer in a way as we try to connect these things. And I'd like to focus on the case of early literacy, of the child going from being pre-literate to having some expertise in reading within their own language as a point of connection between these two very different worlds. So what is it that a brain framework, a systems neuroscience framework might bring to the understanding of this very crucial, culturally constructed transition that we're expecting all children to go through, this journey from being pre-literate to having expertise in literacy such that they can interact with a book and have an experience which is just as immersive as being in the real world, a form of virtual reality through some sort of neural hack. One thing that I think systems neuroscience brings us for understanding this, and I think it has a lot of implications, is from a brain perspective, reading is a really kind of bizarre skill. It's emerging very, very, very late in intellectual development in childhood. And in a sense, it's requiring you to take two very well-articulated cortical representational systems. One that allows us to navigate with great speed and facility in the linguistic world, and the neural representations of the linguistic world, and connect those to the visual world in very powerful ways. The pre-literate child has very well represented systems for recognizing visual objects, for processing shapes, for learning about shapes, and also very different neural codes for representing language and taking auditory, phonemic representations, little elements of speech, and representing them and combining them and building hierarchical representations of those. But very, very late in childhood, because of an invention that a bunch of priests came up with about 6,000 years ago of visual literacy, we now expect the entire population to engage in a systems-level plastic reorganization between these two systems. Whereas we now require children, over just the course of a couple of years, to be able to articulately map many novel shapes within their writing systems and map them very rapidly to very specific linguistic targets. So we're requiring this novel integration between these two systems to create the emergence of this new human ability of rapid visual word recognition, which we can string together to sort of engage in fluent cognition. And in doing so, opening up brand new worlds of intellectual accomplishment, of education and immersion with the exact thoughts of a person who might be distant in time or space. Now, I think that there's a couple of implications for this that they sound, in a sense, quite disconnected from what an educator is struggling with or working with. And a couple of implications that I'd like to push on for today is the notion that if we can understand from this perspective individual differences in these brain mechanisms and how they relate to individual differences in cognition, we might get a new angle into why this integration is so easy for some children and so persistently difficult for others. Secondly, from a systems neuroscience perspective, we might start to begin to understand what are some of the pedagogical forces that allow this integration to happen in the first place. And I'd like to propose that selective attention in the integration of these systems may be playing a key role in integrating and leading to the emergence of literacy. So I want to put this integration problem into perspective because I have the suspicion that nearly everybody in this room is fluent in literacy and can hardly remember the struggles that they went through or why this is such a big deal in the first place by putting this in context with a functional activation map. And some of you may recognize this functional activation map. Some of you were in the area, especially with those with expertise in educational research. This is not a functional activation map of the human brain. It's not a flat map of the macaque cortex, but actually this is a functional activation map of educational achievement in New York City. And the color scale and the labels might help you for some of those who don't travel to New York very often. Here are the boroughs listed, but the most dramatic thing about this functional activation map is the scale, where this gray scale up here is corresponding to 70% of children or more failing to meet basic proficiency standards in 4th grade. At a population level, getting the entire population of K through 4th grade students to carry off this reorganization of brain systems that leads to fluent literacy is actually a deep and perplexing problem. And one that I think this makes the point that if we got a little bit of insight and collaboration between education and neuroscience and made some progress on this, it could have great societal impact. So there's 3 places where I think that the connections are starting to get warmer and the conversations between neuroscience and education are starting to become more deep. And there's 3 different ways, I think, in which neuroscience and education are starting to build a dialogue around some of these notions. So I think that neuroscience, in a way, can contribute a novel look at understanding what are the mechanisms of expertise. If we have a skilled expert reader, we can start to, in a sense, take the clock apart to see what are the parts of those expertise. And we can also look at the development of those expertise, those operations of expertise, to see what is the pathway by which this is changing. But that, in a sense, is building sort of an abstract algorithmic understanding of literacy. I think we start to get even more traction for some of the perplexing problems in education when we start to think about individual differences in brain mechanisms. We can start to make links between individual differences in cognitive achievement and individual differences in things that we can interrogate using brain science to look at physical activity and physical energy levels within the human brain. And we can start to map how is it that individual differences in precursor foundational skills might lead to challenges in integration. But then, finally, the area that I'm most excited about is starting to understand if neuroscience can potentially make a contribution to what you might call effective instruction. It seems to me, in interacting with many educators, that there are some highly skilled educators that when they interact with children, they have a certain constellation of skills that engender change and engender learning. And they're very successful at working with children to sort of produce these changes. And we might get a neuroscience angle on what is it about a highly effective learning environment or a highly effective intervention, which is actually helping to facilitate change for individuals and how this might interact with individual differences in order to build these mechanisms of expertise. That's where I hope that this conversation between neuroscience and education can go, and I think that we're making a couple of steps along the way that I'd like to present rather rapidly. So let's start with mechanisms of expertise. This is in a sense where I came into the field. I was very interested in sort of abstract cognitive models of visual word recognition, which is the sine qua non of literacy. Without rapid visual word recognition, in which you can take thousands of words and map them very specifically to their linguistic targets, or visual words to their linguistic targets, you can engage in fluent literacy, and it plays a huge role in individual differences in reading comprehension. We can start to ask the question, if an individual is very skilled and can, within 200 milliseconds, map a physical stimulus of a visual word directly onto its idea, what are the changes in the brain that support that visual expertise, that perceptual expertise that you build as a skilled reader? And a number of research studies have started to converge on the idea that if you look at this kind of deep network of the visual system, that there's a region pretty far up in the visual system, right at the border between occipital and temporal regions in this ventral processing stream, that change pretty dramatically for skilled readers, in which if you present them with the object of their expertise of a visual word, you'll see increased activity in this region. And this increased activity is quite specific to their very particular learning experiences. It's quite specific to the native language that they've been reading or the foreign language that they've been mastering, and quite different for words, or quite different for things that they haven't been exposed to. So learning experiences, sort of the accumulation of learning experiences, seem to drive plastic changes within a region that serves as a gateway between basic visual recognition and these higher level linguistic skills such as phonology and lexical access. And we can map this out. It's dramatically left lateralized in the visual system for most learners. And there's some really interesting exceptions to that. But as a result of this, if you map out the brain response over time to the object of your expertise as a skilled reader, a visual word, versus some other control stimulus, such as a recombination of the consonants of those words, we see a dramatic spike in brain activity, regardless of whether it's presented to the left visual field or the right visual field. Initially, this makes a huge difference for early visual processing regions, but we see this kind of location invariance and expertise response in this left fusiform gyrus region. So this, in a sense, is a hallmark of expert word recognition, and we can look at the path of development for this in children, and we can map out how it is that this new ability is subserved by changes in these particular cortical circuits. When we start to take advantage of the fact that now we can extend neuroimaging down into development to the very years in which children are first starting to master these skills, we can start to ask new questions, and we can start to look at the great deal of variability that exists in children in terms of how this region is activated when they're examining visual words. And we see, looking at elementary school children from second grade through fifth grade, we see tremendous variability in terms of the degree to which this region is activated by visual words, as well as great variability in these left, mid, and superior temporal gyrus regions, which we think are linked to that. And we can link that variability to individual differences in kids' cognitive skills, precursor skills like their phonological skills, their phonological awareness skills, how well they do on rhyming tasks or tasks that require them to think about auditory words and the sound structure of auditory words. It seems that there's a powerful correlation between how well children do on these phonological awareness tests and the degree of activation that they have when they're reading visual words, suggesting a link between these precursor systems and how well they achieve this skill. Even when they've been exposed to lots and lots of visual words, lots and lots of learning experiences, it seems that there may be something about the integration between these phonological systems and these visual systems which is critical to plastic changes within this region. Mostly this field has been driven by sort of circuit systems level insights in fMRI, which is a very slow hemodynamic technique. There's a stimulus, and over the course of multiple seconds, we're able to look at a response within a brain region. But the hallmarks of visual word recognition expertise is that they happen literally within the blink of an eye. A human eye blink usually takes about 220 milliseconds. Within a blink of an eye, a skilled expert reader has taken any one of 50,000 visual words and turned it into a specific linguistic target within 220 milliseconds. That's how sort of lightning fast these cortical circuits are. We can now use electrophysiology to do something akin to stop motion photography by surrounding the brain with electrical sensors and taking 1,000 pictures a second of the electrical activity as it responds to a particular stimulus, like a word hitting the eye. We can actually stop the action of this cascade of activity directly at the moment, 200 milliseconds or 170 milliseconds, when this physical energy is being converted into a linguistic representation. In a sense, like looking at the topography of water after a drop hits it. And with stop motion photography, you get beautiful insights into the dynamics of water. For instance, you might notice that there's a drop hovering above this, which couldn't be the drop that fell. This is actually an echo drop that leaps up out of the water after you drop the water in. We can, in a sense, interrogate the brain imaging, the brain topography, right at the point at which this is happening, and start to look at the perceptual expertise and how it plays out, as well as how it develops. So here's a topographic map of the back of the head. You might notice these little tiny cartoon ears to orient you. 170 milliseconds after a skilled reader sees the object of their expertise, like a visual word, versus a control stimulus. And these control stimuli have been interrogated at many different levels. It can be stick figures that you've never seen before, or they can be foreign language words, or they can be consonant strings. And consistent with all of these, we see typically this right lateralized novelty-related response versus this left lateralized response that's associated with expertise. And when you do a statistical map of the difference between these, the most robust regions that we see are these left posterior regions that are the signature of expertise in visual word recognition. And that expertise is, by definition, experience dependent. Your learning experiences change the way this brain responds, the way this brain circuit responds within 170 milliseconds of looking at this word. Now, I think, in a sense, when we get a biomarker of a cognitive process like perceptual expertise for visual word recognition, it opens up a new possibility to interrogate individual differences. And in doing so, I think it gives us new insights into the challenges we face as educators. So for instance, there are large individual differences in terms of how children respond to the instruction smile. Most of these kids are doing something like smiling, and I'm not sure why this kid is doing this, but that's what he decided to do. There's also really large individual differences in the brain response to linguistic stimuli and to visual stimuli, and it turns out that those individual differences are not just some sort of random arcane noise, but they seem to map on systematically with how well children are using their brains in engaging in this function of reading and visual word recognition. So if we look at the topography of this expertise response that we see, we are able to pull out a similar image to this when we look at children, except there's much greater variability in that image. And it turns out that that variability has systematic dimensionality to it, such that if we look at the degree to which this response of visual words versus control strings is left lateralized, we see that it maps onto individual variation in terms of how well children are doing at the overall task of pronouncing words that they've never seen before. So there's meaningful variation in terms of how their brains are responding within the first 170 milliseconds of looking at these stimuli and how well they're doing at the global goal-directed task of trying to pronounce words. So we can start to get a new insight into how kids differ. And in doing so, we can push even further to ask this question: how is it that pre-literate skills and individual differences in pre-literate skills are related to this journey of integration that the kids are going to go through in the context of education. So it opens up a new window, which is at once fascinating and at once scary, of being able to take brain images of children even before literacy begins and make predictions of which children are likely to struggle with this integration problem and which children are likely to have great facility in this and do quite well at it, holding instruction constant, roughly. I'd like to point out a colleague of mine who did a postdoc in my lab and then returned to Switzerland to carry out, what did I do? No, I shouldn't hit that one. That's the blackout one. So wait, I'm going to take this away and tell you about it. So Urs Maurer did a wonderful study. What's that? I will. I did it on purpose. Just to build up the dramatic tension here. So Urs Maurer did this amazing study in which he had collected mismatched negativity to auditory stimuli. So he had children listen to a train of stimuli, purely auditory stimuli, before any reading instruction had begun in these children. These were pre-kindergartners. And the stimulus sounded something like da, 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 ta, da, da, da. And when you switch from da to ta, there's a mismatch recognition in most human brains, even rats and monkeys. But there's individual variation in that mismatch response. And he then came and worked with me, and we did all of this stuff on this N170 response. And he decided after 2 years to go back to Switzerland and find these kids again to see if the individual variation that he was seeing in their mismatched negativity response to auditory stimuli would predict where are they in reading now that they're entering second and third grade. And unfortunately, it was a journey of great frustration. He looked at the data every way he could, and there was no relationship between the variation that he saw in auditory mismatched negativity and how well the children were doing with reading. And he persisted, and we had some dialogue about it, and he pushed on, and he started looking at, well, what would happen if we looked later in the signal? Instead of this kind of reflexive response to a mismatched stimulus, which happens very early on, and we're looking at the brain's kind of the exogenous stimulus-driven response, what if we looked later on at the endogenous response? That moment after you switch from da to ta, where you're like, whoa, that was weird and kind of linguistically, but I'm going to go back to what I was doing. This endogenous orienting response, which plays out over the course of 300 or 400 or 500 or 600 milliseconds after the stimulus occurs, turns out that there was large variation in that, even larger than the variation in the mismatch negativity. And what he found was a remarkable difference where, in general, the good readers seemed to show 300 to 600 milliseconds after this linguistic change. No change in the reflexive response, but in the endogenous reflective response, he saw that the good readers were showing a really strong left lateralization, and the poor readers were showing a tendency towards a right lateralization. And when he looked across these children, the degree to which the response, this kind of reflective, slow response that the kids engaged in, the degree to which it was left lateralized was associated with reading very, very well and very, very fluently near the top of the class. And the degree to which they were kind of bilateral or right lateralized was really strongly associated with doing quite poorly. And the magnitude of these differences were huge. Some children were reading twice as fast as the other children. And this was a significant factor in pulling this up. And remarkably, this was a prediction from kindergarten all the way to second and third grade. And some might say it's a post-prediction because he didn't propose that this was going to happen later, but he later discovered it. But they're working on replication efforts now. But this, in a sense, gives us a really interesting handle into this notion that there are meaningful differences in the organization of children's cortical networks even before education starts. And largely, we have very little idea about how that's organized and how we're going to adapt our educational approaches to those insights. We don't understand how and why kids differ. We understand descriptively that they differ, but I think that the effort of and the interesting dialogue between neuroscience and education is this question about how and why do they differ and what can we do about it. So I wanted to How am I doing on time? I've got 7 minutes left. 10, okay. I wanted to kind of bridge that point in the talk to this notion that I'm kind of hopeful about right now. And that is that there's a very powerful concept in cognitive neuroscience, the notion of selective attention being one of the most powerful neuromodulators in the human brain. If you think about the activity in a sensory circuit and describing its activity level, it turns out that goal-directed selective attention is one of the largest ways in which you can modulate that cortical circuit. So if everybody could just take a minute, I assume that everybody, I see all the mouths are closed and people are inhaling and exhaling through their noses, but you haven't been attending to that. I'd like everyone to just take a moment and breathe through your nose, inhale and exhale, and focus your mind on the subtle differences and sensations between the inhale and the exhale. Can you feel that? You're focusing in a goal-directed fashion on this very particular dimension of your sensory experiences. And when you do that, there is a large modulation of a very particular circuit in your brain that represents that area of your nose. Selectively attending in a goal-directed fashion is a powerful neuromodulator. And so I wanted to ask the question, perhaps something that's going on in highly successful education is that teachers are guiding the attention of children to a very particular and useful part of information space. They are modulating neural circuits, and they're focusing the mind on very useful information, and this may be playing a role in how neural circuits are changing over the course of the learning experience. So that sounds like a wild speculation in a way. How could we start to build a science around this kind of notion, contextualized within the question of early literacy and individual differences in phonological processing, leading to individual differences in expertise? So I want to just briefly pose this question. How does directing your attention to phonology in sounds as a skilled reader activate this circuitry, which is we've been characterizing as the expertise center for visual perceptual expertise of visual word recognition? So I want to engage in a little experiment. It might not work, partly because of technical difficulties, but I'm going to play chimeric sounds to you. And I want you to focus your attention, just kind of like you did with your nose, but now in auditory space. Complex auditory information. I want you to focus your attention on 3 little tones that are embedded in this chimeric stimulus.
Bass.
And then this one.
Bass. Noise.
So did those 3 tones, in a sense, rhyme? Were the last 2 notes the same in both triplets, or were they different? There's a visual cue up here if you want to cheat. Different, okay. So, but now I want you to use your goal-directed skills to focus your mind on the phonology within the words and tell me whether these 2 auditory words rhyme or not. Whoop, technical difficulty. I was predicting that.
Bass. Noise.
Do those 2 words rhyme? Okay, so now we can ask the question. We've got all of the hallmarks of a selective attention experiment. We've got a chimeric stimulus, we've got competing stimulus dimensions, and we have a goal-directed instruction to do a difficult task on one dimension versus another. And the question is, how does this change brain activity? And we were able to isolate a very powerful left lateralized circuit in the brain that was simply the result of listening to the same exact stimulus and doing an equally difficult task under both conditions, but focusing your mind on the dimension or the computation of phonology versus tones led to a dramatic, goal-directed, top-down selective attention modulation of a very particular circuit. This circuit was left lateralized. We saw kind of these frontal regions associated with phonology and Broca's area and articulation. We also saw these mid-temporal and superior temporal gyrus foci that are associated with representing auditory phonology. And remarkably, we saw activation of this visual expertise region for recognizing visual words. We interrogated this further, and we found, remarkably, that when you're focusing your mind on the phonology, on the rhyme, this very region, this mid-fusiform region that's associated with visual word recognition, showed a selective activation over baseline, specifically within the left hemisphere. No modulation at all in the anterior or posterior regions of the fusiform gyrus, no modulation at all of the right hemisphere, very specific top-down reentrant activation of this very particular cortical circuit that's involved in visual word recognition. In a sense, we're seeing the integration between phonological computations and orthographic computations within the brain. We probed this further using electrophysiology to ask, is this really some kind of late in the game process of comparison and response selection, or is this something in which we're actually changing the brain's processes kind of reflectively immediately after this phonological information occurs, and during the perceptual encoding processes of these. And we were able to show evidence that right here, similar to what we saw in the children experiment, right around 500 to 600 milliseconds, we saw very significant top-down modulation of the goals of encoding. Intentionally focusing on the phonology of these sounds led to a left lateralized modulation that happened right during the early encoding of this first word. We're actually dynamically changing the brain's response to auditory stimuli based on this goal of focusing on phonology. So the last question I have is, suppose we put this in a learning context. Most selective attention research that I've ever seen in my life is very, very focused on the very moment. What's happening in the moment that you're processing the stimuli? If you selectively attend to one thing versus another thing, we can see neural modulation of circuits. But what if we iterate that over the course of learning, such that we have a pedagogical environment or a teacher or curriculum materials that are consistently focusing the mind on particular computations like connecting phonology to orthography in particular ways? Would that change the brain responses that we see? And so we've been doing experiments with adults in which it's beautiful to fit this into the context of this symposium. For those of you who have been to the earlier talks, we can look at novel shape learning. We can look at statistical learning of stimuli when we're asking people to read 16 to 64 characters of a novel writing system, some novel shapes that we've created. And we can look at how is learning persisting over the course. These are actually just made of the same 12 hidden letters, repeated and combined in different ways. How is learning proceeding when we have an instructor which either just encourages sort of paying attention to these relationship between visual words and auditory words, versus in your mind's eye, try to focus your attention on each individual letter within a word form and relate it to these sublexical phonological units. And we wanted to see whether this could impact the early responses to these shapes, such that the way the teacher scaffolds a learning process might have a big impact on how the brain later reacts to those stimuli that you learned. So we brought people back either 24 hours or immediately after learning. It seems like it didn't make a difference. And we presented these stimuli to them. And it turns out that the people who were randomly assigned to this grapheme phoneme focus condition showed this striking left lateralized response. It was delayed by about 20 milliseconds. So instead of an N170, we got this N190. And the people who were randomly assigned to the whole word focus showed this strong kind of novelty-related response that we see with control symbols, suggesting that the way in which a teacher focuses the mind of the learner has a profound impact on the neural circuitry which are recruited later during learning. And then in the last 1 minute, we've been linking this to educational software to see whether we can replicate this and make translational extensions into New York City public schools. We've been designing software. I can go into the details with anybody who's interested, but essentially the software has many cognitively inspired components which focuses the learner's mind on the role that each individual grapheme plays and its relationship to its subsyllabic phonology. It's highly adaptive. It's a tutor-based system. And we carried out randomized controlled experiments in New York City public schools. And we were able to demonstrate that just 20, 40-minute sessions interacting with this software had a profound impact in a university-based study over a waiting list control group in terms of how well children can pronounce words that they never saw before. And then we decided to turn this into a randomized tutor study in which tutors were paired with children and randomly assigned to either working with the guided tutor system in New York City public schools versus using the software, which really focused the student's mind on these grapheme-phoneme connections in this way that we suggest. And we noticed that we saw equal replication sort of out in the wild with these work-study tutors who were working with these students. The effect sizes were sort of in the mid-30s for those of you who are interested in that, and corresponded roughly to 1.2 grade levels of advancement on the standardized tests. We also had some pilot data suggesting that this learning experience, when done before and after, leads to changes in brain activity. And the field is now emerging in which I think a powerful new dynamic is going to happen in the conversation between education and neuroscience. And that's what I call the educational neuroscience sandwich study. And the bread is the before and the after brain image done with a child as they're about to go through a learning experience. And the meat in this sandwich is actually the educational experience itself. So we can structure educational experiences along dimensions that matter in education, real-world educational contexts. And we can start to make mappings between hypothesized mechanisms of effective instruction and changes within very particular neural circuits. And I think that this, in a sense, has all the hallmarks for a state shift in the discussion between education and neuroscience, and I can see lots of sort of two-way exciting conversations emerging out of this, and I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.
So you showed this study at the end with the intervention, and you show the behavioral change where you get this nice effect of increases in student outcomes. So what's the added value of the neuroscience data from the content or from the perspective of the practitioner trying to decide whether or not to adopt a particular intervention?
Yeah, I don't know that it translates into that decision directly, sort of on the ground, but I do know that one of the challenging things about educational testing and educational research is that behaviors can change for a number of reasons. And sometimes those reasons are not necessarily related to a very particular cognitive function that we've gone to great pains to isolate. And so I think that you can extend the dialogue about, okay, we do notice a change, but now when we try to deconstruct it and understand what that change is, that this can have added value. And there can also be, if you think about research cycles, kind of a nice sort of increased construct validity sort of check between the cognitive tests and the neural effects that we're seeing, where one sort of scaffolds the other in a way that we're sort of converging on concepts that have utility both in the world of neural activation, cognitive description, and education. And I think that that convergence takes sort of a lot of community coordination.
Thank you. Maybe this will be covered in the next talk about evolution, but these chimps at Yerkes, I believe it was, that learned several dozen words, does that mean that, but they were using rewards, and it's quite different from what you've described, but does that mean the brain setup is similar, or is it quite different?
I would speculate that it's quite different. I think that the way in which we learn something may have a profound impact on the very particular circuitry that changes, and it's a kind of a bigger dialogue than this, but just as a brief example, we could see in the little toy experiment I gave with the Martian alphabet that both groups actually learned. Their behavior increased. And when you just posed, did learning occur, were they able to recognize these words they studied? Yes, learning occurred, and it was roughly the same when you looked at the item level. However, the neural circuitries associated with that learning was actually radically different and tied to the very particular instruction that they got. If you have a bunch of monkeys playing with visual words and learning to recognize them, they might even see sort of statistical learning patterns that are occurring, but those might not be connected to something that we call phonology for a lot of potentially obvious reasons and potentially for some deep reasons as well. So I think that there may be a difference between just sort of orthosyntactic learning about what's the likelihood that these letters are going to co-occur within the visual system, and constraints actually coming in top-down from the phonological system that are sort of required for this orthographic phonological integration. Thanks.
Let's thank Bruce.